good evening, and welcome back. Tonight we are going somewhere that exists precisely at the crossroads of documented history and enduring legend, somewhere that feels at once completely medieval and startlingly modern, somewhere that raises questions about power and faith, and greed and justice that have never entirely been answered, not in 700 years of trying, so get comfortable. Settle into wherever you are listening from. Let the quiet of the night gather around you. As always, let me know where in the world you are resting your head tonight. And now, let us begin. There is a particular kind of road that only the medieval world produced, not the wide paved arterials of the Roman Empire, long since crumbled into disrepair and reclaimed by scrub and dust, not the organized highways of a kingdom with a functioning bureaucracy and a standing army to police them. These were narrower things, meandering tracks through landscape that had been organized by neither empire nor law, but only by the slow pressure of footsteps over centuries, paths that wound through the Judean hills in unpredictable curves, that dropped suddenly into ravines where shadows pooled even at noon, that crossed the same dry riverbed 6 times in a single morning, that offered no shelter and no safety and no guarantee of arrival. They were the roads to Jerusalem. And in the early years of the 12th century, they were among the most dangerous stretches of ground in the known world. The First Crusade had ended in 1099 with the capture of Jerusalem by the Christian armies of Europe. It had been an event of extraordinary violence. The city had been held by a Fatimid garrison, and when the Crusader forces finally breached the walls after weeks of siege, what followed was a massacre of a scale and comprehensiveness that shocked even contemporary observers who were not particularly squeamish about such things. Thousands of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were killed in the days following the breach, their bodies piled in the streets. The great historian of the Crusades, Stephen Runciman, described the capture of Jerusalem as the greatest crime committed by a generation already prone to crimes, which gives you some sense of how the event was eventually assessed even by Thest, sympathetic to the crusading project. The streets were washed down afterward. Churches were reclaimed. The holiest city in Christendom was Christian again for the first time in generations. And then the armies that had done this began to go home. Most of them anyway, the Crusaders who had survived the campaign, who had walked or ridden from their homes in France and Germany and England and Italy, who had crossed the Alps and the Balkans and the deserts of Anatolia, who had laid siege to Antioch for 9 grinding months, who had starved and fought and died by the thousands before ever reaching Jerusalem. These men had made vows to reach the holy city and pray at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Having done that, their obligation was technically discharged, and so they went home. What remained behind was a shell, a handful of knights and infantry stretched across a territory that bore no resemblance to the kind of organized defensive zone that a military strategist would have chosen to hold. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, newly proclaimed, was surrounded on every side by Islamic forces that were regrouping, reorganizing, reconsidering. The interior of the country was largely hostile. The ports were vulnerable. The roads, those terrible narrow roads through the hills, were patrolled by no one in any reliable sense. And word was spreading through Europe that the holy city was open. The pilgrimage was possible. You could go. You could walk where Christ had walked. You could touch the stone of the tomb. You could stand in the church built over the place of the crucifixion and feel, if the medieval sources are to be believed, the presence of the sacred so forcefully that it could bring a grown man to his knees, weeping without being intirable. Ye sure why. So they came, in hundreds and then thousands. Men who had prayed their entire lives to make this journey. Women who had saved for years to fund it. Couples who traveled together. Families who made it a shared pilgrimage. individuals who set out alone with a staff and a prayer, and nothing much else. They landed at the port of Jaffa on the Mediterranean coast and then faced the inland journey of roughly 50 miles to Jerusalem itself, a distance that sounds almost trivially short until you factor in the terrain, the summer heat, the lack of any reliable supply of water, and the very real possibility that armed men were waiting for you around any bend in the road. The banditry on these roads was not random opportunism. It was organized, regular, and brutal. Groups of local fighters operated in the hills between the coast and the holy city, preying on pilgrims with a reliability that would have been almost admirable if the consequences were not so terrible. Travelers who set out in small groups from Jaffa frequently did not arrive in Jerusalem. They were robbed. They were killed. They were taken captive and sold into slavery in the markets of Alexandria or Cairo. They were stripped of everything they had and left to die of exposure in the hills. One particularly well-documented massacre, which occurred near the Jordan River and left more than 300 pilgrims dead or enslaved, was the kind of event that circulated through the story networks of medieval Europe and strengthened the conviction that something had to be done into this world. In or around the year 1110 came a small group of French knights. Their leader was Jacques de Pines, a man born around 1070, almost certainly from the small village of Pines near the city of Troyes in the Champagne region of northeastern France. We know frustratingly little about his personal history. He was of noble birth, that much is clear. He had connections to the powerful and wealthy Count of Champagne, Hugh I, a relationship that would prove invaluable in the years ahead. He was a knight in the full medieval sense, trained from youth to ride and fight, who had made the journey to the Holy Land and chosen, unlike the majority of crusaders, to remain. He understood what the roads were like. He understood what the pilgrims were experiencing. And he had, apparently, been thinking about what to do about it for some time. The idea that Hoots de Pines brought to King Baldwin II of Jerusalem was as simple as it was unprecedented. He proposed the creation of a permanent, dedicated military force whose sole purpose would be to protect the pilgrimage routes. Not mercenaries who would serve whoever paid them and leave when the money ran out. Not feudal levies who served their lords for set periods and then returned home. Instead, he proposed a body of men who would take religious vows, who would commit themselves for life to the protection of pilgrims, who would live as monks but fight as warriors. Men who could not be bought, could not be dismissed, and could not leave because they had vowed before God to stay. Baldwin, who was a practical man with an impossible job, grasped the value of this immediately. The skeleton garrison he was trying to maintain across the whole of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was desperate for committed, permanent soldiers of any kind. The offer of men who would serve for life, who required no payment in the conventional feudal sense, who organized and disciplined themselves, was the kind of thing you did not turn down. He agreed to the proposal. He provided the new order with quarters in a wing of his own royal palace, located on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, in the complex that the Crusaders knew as the Temple of Solomon, built over or near the ruins of the ancient Jewish Temple T, had been destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. From this location, the order took its name. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, a phrase that would eventually be shortened to the Knights of the Temple. The Templars, the founding membership, stood at approximately 9 men. Hughes de Pines himself, Godfrey de Saint-Omer, who came from the northern French city of Saint-Omer, and who seems to have been the co-founder in the most literal sense, a man without whom the project might not have got started. André de Montbard, whose significance lay partly in his family connections. He was an uncle of Bernard of Clairvaux, the great Cistercian abbot who would become the order's most important advocate, Payen de Montdidier. Geoffrey Bissol, and several others whose names are recorded with varying consistency across the sources. 9 men, that was the beginning. 9 knights, who stood before the Patriarch of Jerusalem, the highest ecclesiastical authority in the Holy City, and took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, the traditional monastic vows, but combined them with a military mission, T had no precedent in the Christian religious tradition. This combination, which seems so obvious in retrospect, was revolutionary in its theological implications in ways that the medieval world recognized immediately. The traditional division of medieval Christian society was between those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. Monks prayed, knights fought, peasants worked. Each category had its place in the divine order, and the categories were understood to be fairly impermeable. A monk was a man who had withdrawn from the world to devote himself to God. A knight was a man embedded in the world, serving his lord, fighting when required, doing the necessarily violent work of maintaining political order. The two were not supposed to mix. A monk who fought was a contradiction. A knight who prayed with monastic discipline was a curiosity. Bernard of Clairvaux would resolve this theological tension in the most influential way possible, but that was still a decade away. For the first years of their existence, the Templars operated in something of an institutional fog. They had royal approval, they had the blessing of the local patriarch, but they had no formal rule of life, no official recognition from the church in Rome, no distinctive uniform, no seal, no way to recruit members from across Europe, no established mechanism for receiving donations, no legal identity that would allow them to hold property in their own name. They were, in the language of institutional history, an informal arrangement that had not yet been formalized. The early years were humble in ways that the later legend of the Templars sometimes obscures. The famous image on the Templars' official seal, 2 knights sharing a single horse, is often interpreted as symbolic of brotherhood and community. It may also have been an accurate reflection of their early poverty. They patrolled their roads, they prayed their hours, they buried the pilgrims they found dead, and rescued the ones they could reach in time. No great battles, no famous victories, almost no mention in the chronicles of the day. They existed and they did their work. And for 9 or 10 years, that was about the extent of it. What changed everything was not a military victory or a political appointment. It was a letter, or more precisely, a series of arguments made by one of the most brilliant and influential men of the 12th century, a Cistercian monk and abbot named Bernard of Clairvaux, who would later be canonized as a saint and who, in his own life debt, was arguably the single most powerful non-royal voice in all of Christendom. Bernard could launch a crusade with a speech, which he eventually did. He could make or break papal candidates, which he also did, and he could give a small group of knights a theological identity so compelling that it would transform them into an institution capable of changing the world. The connection between Bernard and the Templars came through André de Montbard, one of the founding 9, who was Bernard's maternal uncle. Whether it was this family connection or something Bernard saw in the Templar idea that drew his attention, the great abbot became the order's most powerful advocate at exactly the moment when advocacy was most needed. In 1112-9, Hugues de Payens traveled to France to attend the Council of Troyes, a gathering of church leaders at which the Templars would seek formal recognition. Bernard was there. Bernard had prepared, and when the council approved the Templars and Pope Honorius II gave his formal blessing to the new order, Bernard took up his pen and wrote what may be the most effective piece of institutional advocacy in medieval history, a text called in praise of the new knighthood. In this remarkable document, Bernard did something that had never quite been done before. He articulated a complete theology of holy warfare that made the Templar Knight not just acceptable to the Church, but positively exemplary. The traditional knight, Bernard argued, fought for earthly reasons: glory, land, plunder, the approval of his lord. When he killed, even in what passed for a just cause, there was blood on his soul. He fought to advance himself in the world, and the world was where sin lived. But the Templar Knight was different in kind, not just in degree. He fought for God alone, against enemies who were the enemies of all Christendom. When he killed such an enemy, it was not murder. Bernard used a Latin play on words to make the point. The Templar did not commit homicidium, the killing of a man, but malicidium, the killing of evil. And when the Templar himself was killed in the course of this sacred work, he did not merely die. He was martyred. He died for Christ, and Christ received him directly. This was theology with practical consequences. It meant that a man who felt called to violence, who had the skills of a warrior, and the energy of someone who needed to be doing rather than contemplating, could now devote all of that to God in a way that was not just tolerated, but celebrated. The Templar Knight was not a monk who had failed at contemplation and picked up a sword as a consolation prize. He was a new kind of holy man that the world had never seen. A warrior of God in the most literal sense possible. Bernard's word for them was the milites novi, the new soldiers. And the image was powerful enough to transform the reception of the Templars throughout Europe almost overnight. The Council of Troyes in 1009-12 was the moment of institutional birth, official recognition, papal blessing, a rule of life, shaped significantly by Bernard himself, that codified in meticulous detail every aspect of how a Templar was to live. And recruitment. The letters of credit and the donation flows began almost immediately. Men of good family who had wondered what to do with their military training and their religious impulses now had an answer. Estates began to arrive, bequeathed by the dying who wanted the prayers of holy warriors to speed their souls through purgatory. Money came in, and with money came the possibility of organization on a scale that had not been imaginable. When 9 knights were quartered in one wing of a palace on the Temple Mount, the physical appearance of the Templars became fixed in this period. The white mantle, the plain surcoat that marked them as members of the order, was their initial distinguishing garment. In 1146, Pope Eugenius III added the red cross worn on the left breast directly over the heart, which transformed the visual identity of the Templars into something that the medieval world would recognize instantly at any distance. White mantle, red cross. The image became synonymous with crusading itself when artists painted battle scenes from the Crusades. It was the Templar colors they reached for first. When chroniclers described the aftermath of a great battle in the Holy Land, the Templars in their white and red were usually among the most prominent. They had become, through Bernard's advocacy and the Pope's blessing and the logic of their own mission, the symbol of Christian military power in the age of the Crusades. The rule that governed Templar life was extraordinarily detailed and demanding in the way that only an institution built for total commitment could sustain. Knights ate in communal silence. They were permitted meat no more than 3 times per week, in keeping with monastic dietary restrictions. All contact with women was forbidden, even with female relatives, even with the innocent kind that no one could have objected to in any other context. Correspondence with family members required authorization from the master. Travel outside the commandery required permission. Personal property was not permitted. Any gift received had to be handed over to the order's collective resources. The day was structured around the canonical hours, the fixed times of prayer that organized monastic life. Beginning before dawn and running through the evening, they heard Mass before battle and confessed before they could receive communion. They slept in common dormitories, often in their armor, or at least with their weapons within reach, ready to move at the shortest possible notice. The rules specified what they ate and what they wore and how they sat at table and in what order they processed to chapel and what happened if they broke any of the many regulations that governed their lives. The penalties for violations ranged from minor public penance through loss of the habit, which amounted to expulsion, to permanent imprisonment in the order's own dungeons for the most serious offenses. The rule also, fascinatingly, specified that certain things were not to be spoken of outside the order's meetings. The Templars had institutional secrets. They had things they did not tell the outside world. This fact would later be used against them in ways they could not have anticipated. The most significant privilege the order received in these early decades of recognition and growth came in 1139, when Pope Innocent II issued a papal bull called Omne Datum, optimum, the phrase translating roughly as every perfect gi, fis. What this document gave the Templars was something no military organization had ever received from Rome before. It placed them entirely outside the jurisdiction of local bishops, local lords, and local kings. Templars answered to the Pope alone. No one else could tax them. No one else could excommunicate them. No local church official had authority over their priests or their churches. They could cross any border in Christendom without paying tolls or customs duties. They were, in the language of modern political science, a sovereign entity, answerable to no secular authority whatsoever, operating within the borders of every kingdom in Europe while being subject to the laws of none of them. The significance of this cannot be overstated when thinking about both the Order's rise and its eventual destruction. The same independence that allowed the Templars to grow wealthy, recruit freely, manage their properties across multiple jurisdictions without bureaucratic interference, and accumulate the institutional muscle that would eventually make the M one of the most powerful organizations in medieval Europe, was the independence that would make them, in the eyes of certain rulers, an intolerable anomaly, a state within a state, an organization that crossed borders without paying, that commanded its own army, that held the debts of monarchs, and that answered to a distant pope rather than the king whose land it occupied. For a certain kind of king, this was not just inconvenient. It was an affront that eventually required action, but that reckoning was still nearly 2 centuries away. In the middle decades of the 12th century, what the Templars represented was something the medieval world embraced with something close to enthusiasm. The order grew with startling speed. Commanderies spread across France, England, the Iberian Peninsula, the German lands, and the Italian states. Donations flowed in from noble families across Europe. Estates and vineyards and farms and urban properties transferred to the order by men and women who wanted the spiritual benefits of association with the warrior monks. The military wing of the order, the actual fighting knights, was always a minority of the total membership, perhaps as small as 10%. The majority of Templars were non-combatants, administrators, farmers, craftsmen, priests, all contributing to the enormous logistical enterprise that kept the fighting order fed, armed, housed, and functioning. In the Holy Land itself, the Templars became a fighting force of extraordinary significance. Professional soldiers, at a time when professional soldiers were essentially unavailable to any secular ruler who was not simultaneously managing a feudal empire. The Templars were always ready, always trained, always disciplined. They garrisoned fortresses and watchtowers along the pilgrimage routes and the frontiers of the Crusader states. They built new castles at strategic points where the geography demanded them. They participated in every major military campaign the Kingdom of Jerusalem mounted, and in many minor ones as well, and they died in extraordinary numbers because their rule demanded that they fight to the last, that they not retreat unless the odds were greater than 3-1, that they not negotiate their own ransoms, that they meet capture with expectation of execution rather than the hope of release. Saladin, who retook Jerusalem in 1187, and who was in many ways a more admirable figure than the Crusaders he fought against, made a habit of executing captured Templars and Hospitallers rather than ransoming them. He understood that these men were too dangerous to let live and too disciplined to be broken or turned. The battles the Templars fought in the Holy Land were often desperate, often ended in heavy Templar casualties, and sometimes ended in defeats that look catastrophic from a modern perspective. The Battle of the Horns of Hattin in 1187, at which Saladin destroyed the combined military power of the Crusader states in a single afternoon by the simple expedient of cutting off their water supply in summer heat, saw hundreds of Templars killed or executed. The Grand Master of the time, Gerard de Riedfort, was captured and later ransomed, a rare exception to the pattern, though he returned to fight again and was killed the following year at the Siege of Acre. These were not men fighting from comfortable positions of security. They were fighting in the most dangerous theater of warfare available in the 12th and 13th centuries, against opponents who were often their equals or superiors in numbers and logistics, under conditions that would have broken less disciplined forces within weeks. But the deeper transformation happening within the order during these same decades, the transformation that would in the end determine the order's fate more completely than any battle, was financial rather than military, and it began as most transformations do, not with a grand vision but with a practical problem that needed a practical solution. The problem was simple to state and enormously complex to solve. The Templars were an international organization in a world where moving money across borders was dangerous, slow, and prohibitively expensive. A pilgrim who had saved for years to fund a journey to Jerusalem could not carry that savings in coin form from London or Paris to the Holy Land without accepting a near certain probability of losing it to bandits, pirates, or simple misfortune long before arriving. A merchant who needed to fund activities in multiple countries faced the same problem at larger scale. A king who needed to pay troops fighting in a theater far from his treasury had no reliable way to get the money there without sending an armed escort the whole way, which was its own expense and its own risk. What the Templars developed, sometime around the middle years of the 12th century, was a solution so elegant and so consequential that its descendants are still in use today in every transaction you make on a credit card or through a banking transfer. The mechanism was what we would now call a letter of credit. A depositor would arrive at a Templar commandery, deposit funds or valuables with the brothers there, and receive in exchange a written document, sealed and encoded, that described what had been deposited and by whom. This document could then be carried, safely and without the risk attached to carrying the actual money, to any other Templar commandery along the route. There, upon presentation of the document, the depositor could withdraw the equivalent value. The system was elegant for multiple reasons. The depositor was protected from the physical risk of carrying wealth through dangerous territory. The Templars held the deposited funds and could, in the time between deposit and withdrawal, put those funds to productive use, which was the foundation of what would become fractional reserve banking. The encoded letters were resistant to forgery. The Templars used seals, specific cipher systems, and sometimes physical descriptions of the bearer that needed to be matched at the point of withdrawal, making fraudulent presentation of a letter extraordinarily difficult, and the whole system rested on the one asset the Templars had in greater abundance than any other institution in medieval Europe: a reputation for absolute trustworthiness. You could hand your life savings to a Templar commandery in London, knowing, with as much certainty as the medieval world permitted, that the money would still be there when you arrived in Jerusalem. The expansion of this system into something recognizable as a banking network happened rapidly, because the system was useful to an enormous range of people beyond pilgrims. Merchants discovered that the Templar network allowed them to conduct business across multiple countries without physically moving money, which reduced their transaction costs and their risks simultaneously. Lords discovered that they could fund military operations in distant theaters without the expense and danger of a treasure convoy. Kings discovered that the Templars were not just the most reliable military force in Christendom, but also the most reliable financial institution, one that could hold royal revenues in security, manage the transfer of funds between distant treasuries, and extend credit when the royal coffers were temporarily empty. The French royal treasury, at various points in the 13th century, was maintained at the Great Templar Fortress in Paris. The tower, known simply as the Temple, a fortified complex in the northeastern quarter of the city, whose physical presence in the landscape was as clear a statement of institutional power as any royal palace. The English crown used the London Temple for similar purposes, storing tax revenues, crown jewels, and sensitive financial documents in the vaults that the Templars' military reputation guaranteed better than any stone wall. The papacy banked with the Templars. The nobility of half a dozen countries kept accounts with them. Individual merchants and travelers used their services daily, in commanderies from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the borders of the Armenian kingdom in the far east of the crusading world. By the 13th century, the Templars had evolved from a military order with financial side activities into something more accurately described as a financial institution with a military wing. The majority of their activities, measured by time, by manpower, and by organizational complexity, were administrative and financial rather than military. They managed thousands of properties across Europe, maintaining records that would be the envy of many a modern corporation, tracking rents and revenues and expenses with a sophistication that drew on the best accounting practices available in the medieval world. They moved money across borders through a network of commanderies that served as combined military bases, administrative centers, banks, and inns for traveling members and associates of the order. Their clerks kept double records, one held locally and one dispatched to the central archive, so that disputes about accounts could be resolved with reference to multiple sources. The Templars' lending activities were perhaps even more significant than their deposit and transfer services. In a world where the Church officially prohibited the charging of interest on loans as the sin of usury, the Templars had developed sophisticated legal mechanisms to make lending profitable without technically crossing the canonical line. They charged fees for their financial services rather than interest on principal. They accepted a share of revenues from agricultural estates or commercial ventures as repayment rather than demanding principal plus percentage increase. They found creative structures that allowed them to generate returns on their lending activities while remaining within the letter, if not always the spirit of canon law. The sums involved in their lending to royal clients were enormous by any medieval standard. Louis VII of France drew heavily on Templar resources to fund the Second Crusade in the 1140s. Henry II of England used the London Templars to manage complex financial transactions involving the purchase of islands and the settlement of feudal disputes. Philip II of France deposited his personal treasury with the Paris Templars for safekeeping during a military campaign. The kings of England stored crown jewels and important documents at the Temple in London, which was essentially a royal safe deposit box operated by an organization they could trust more than their own courtiers. At various points in the 13th century, the Templars were simultaneously bankers to the King of France, the King of England, the King of Aragon, and the papacy, a conflict of interest that would have been extraordinary in a modern context, but that in the medieval world was simply evidence of how thoroughly the order had made itself indispensable. The wealth that flowed through the Templar network was, by the standards of the medieval world, breathtaking. Historians estimate that the order's annual income in the late 13th century may have exceeded that of most European monarchies, including France. Their property holdings covered hundreds of thousands of acres. Their non-military operations generated revenues from agriculture, wool production, winemaking, milling, fishing, and a dozen other activities. And all of this wealth served to reinforce the institutional power that the papal privileges had established. An organization of this financial weight, operating under papal protection and exempt from secular authority, was effectively a stente, within every state it operated in. No king could tax it, no bishop could excommunicate it, no court could summon it. It answered to the Pope alone, and the Pope was conveniently far away. This extraordinary institutional independence was the other side of the coin from the order's extraordinary usefulness, and the combination was producing, in the minds of certain rulers, a growing and dangerous resentment. The Templars were indispensable. They were also untouchable, and those two qualities together, over time, created something that no amount of military reputation or papal privilege could ultimately protect against. The determination of a powerful man to bring them down. The military story of the Knights Templar and the financial story of the Knights Templar ran in parallel for most of the 12th and 13th centuries, with one feeding and supporting the other in ways that made the order's position for most of its history, unassailable. The castles they built and garrisoned across the Holy Land and its frontiers were among the most formidable military engineering of the medieval period. The income generated by their European properties funded the continuous maintenance of these fortresses and the armies that held them. The financial networks allowed them to move resources quickly to wherever they were needed, and the military reputation they built in the Holy Land gave them the moral authority that justified their financial privileges in Europe. The great Templar castles of the Holy Land deserve particular attention because they represented something that even modern visitors to the region can still appreciate in the ruins. These were not simple fortifications thrown up in a hurry. They were carefully designed, strategically positioned, continuously maintained and improved over generations, and engineered to withstand sieges that might last for months or even years. Castle Pilgrim, known in French as Château Pèlerin, was built by the Templars on the coast of what is now Israel in the early 13th century, on a promontory that the sea protected on three sides and that the order defended with walls. Massive, and so carefully positioned that no Muslim army ever succeeded in capturing it. The fortress held until 1291, when the Templars simply abandoned it, after the fall of Acre made it strategically irrelevant, not because anyone had breached its walls. The Templar role in the siege warfare of the Crusades went beyond simply holding fortifications. They were among the best trained and most experienced soldiers available to any crusading force, and their presence in an army was understood to represent a significant multiplier of that army's capability. When Richard I of England arrived in the Holy Land during the Third Crusade in 190 to 192, he relied heavily on the Templars as the professional military core of his force. Their discipline in the march, their ability to hold formation under arrow fire, their capacity to time a charge with the precision that the chaos of medieval battle made so difficult. These were the qualities that distinguished them from feudal levies that made up most crusading armies, and that made the Templars so valuable. They were also, it must be said, not infallible. The Templars were involved in several of the most catastrophic military disasters of the crusading period, sometimes as victims of circumstances beyond any individual's control, and sometimes as contributors to strategic decisions that historians have subsequently judged harshly. The Battle of Hattin in 1187, which resulted in the loss of Jerusalem and the near-total destruction of the Crusader field army, was precipitated by a decision to abandon a defensible position and march across waterless terrain in July heat. The Grand Master of the Templars at the time, Gerard de Riedfort, was among those who advocated for the march, a decision that gave Saladin exactly the kind of engagement he had been seeking. A static battle in open ground where his numbers and his control of the water supply would be decisive. Hundreds of Templars died at Hattin, and Saladin personally supervised the execution of those captured. having the knights beheaded by Sufi scholars who wanted the spiritual merit of killing holy warriors, a detail that says something about how both sides understood the religious dimensions of the conflict. The loss of Jerusalem in 1187 was the defining catastrophe of the crusading era. The city that had given the Templars their name, the Temple Mount from which they took their identity and their mission, was gone. They retreated to Acre, the great port city on the Mediterranean coast that became the new capital of what remained of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. Acre was an impressive fortified city, strong walls, a sophisticated harbor, a cosmopolitan culture shaped by the collision of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish influences that the Crusades had produced in the Levant. The Templars built their headquarters in the southwestern corner of the city, a fortified complex that included a great tower overlooking the harbor, the kind of structure that announced institutional power to anyone approaching by sea. For the 100 years between the loss of Jerusalem and the final fall of Acre, the Templars fought a grinding, attritional defensive campaign in the Holy Land that received far less romantic attention than the great battles and sieges of the earlier period. But that was in many ways more grueling. Skirmish after skirmish, raid and counter-raid, the slow dismantling of the Crusader defensive network by the Mamluk Sultanate, the Egyptian military dynasty that had replaced the Ayyubids of Saladin and that proved to be an even more formidable adversary. Under the great Mamluk Sultan Baybars, who came to power in the 1260s, fortress after fortress that had anchored the Crusader presence in the region fell to methodical siege operations. The Templars fought in all of them, died in most of them, and found themselves by the late 13th century holding on by their fingernails to a steadily shrinking strip of coastline. The final blow came in the spring of 1291. The Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, successor to Baybars and his son Kalawun, marched on Acre with an army that contemporary sources describe as extraordinary in scale. Estimates of the Mamluk force vary widely, as medieval chroniclers were not precise statisticians, but the consensus is that the besieging army significantly outnumbered the defenders by a factor that made the eventual outcome a matter of hen rather than weather. The Crusaders inside Acre, including the forces of all three military orders plus whatever reinforcements had been scraped together from Cyprus and the remnants of the Crusader territories, numbered in the low thousands at best. Perhaps 600 to 700 knights and somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 infantry, depending on the source. The Mamluks brought with them a siege train of extraordinary sophistication. Massive trebuchets with names like Victorious and Furious. Weapons so large that the largest had to be disassembled for transport and reassembled at the siege site, a project that took a month. These machines hammered the walls of Acre with continuous bombardment from multiple directions, working in coordinated shifts around the clock so that the defenders could never rest and could never repair the damage fast enough. Teams of sappers undermined the foundations of walls and towers, while archers kept the defenders' heads down. It was siege warfare, conducted with the kind of systematic, methodical professionalism that the Mamluks had been developing over decades of successful campaigns against Crusader fortifications. The Templars and Hospitallers mounted desperate counterattacks. On the night of April 14, the Templar Grand Master William of Beaujeu personally led a cavalry sortie against the Mamluk encampment outside the walls, an attempt to disrupt the siege operations and destroy artillery. It went wrong in the darkness, the horses tangling their legs in the tent ropes of the enemy camp, the element of surprise lost in a confusion of shouting and torchlight. 18 Templars were killed. The Hospitallers tried a similar sortie days later under a moonless sky, launching from the Gate of St. Anthony, and it failed as well with similar losses. There would be no more such attempts. The defenders settled into a purely reactive strategy. trying to shore up the walls where the trebuchets had done their worst damage, trying to keep the defenders fed and rested, trying not to think about how the mathematics of the situatio were developing. On May 18th, 1291, the mathematics resolved. The Mamluks broke through multiple points in the walls simultaneously, thousands of soldiers pouring through the breaches at once, accompanied by the thunderous beating of drums carried on hundreds of camels. A sonic assault designed to tear, rifle the defenders and disorient their response. William of Beaujeu was mortally wounded defending one of the inner gates, struck under the armpit by an arrow or javelin in the precise spot where his armor left him exposed. His men told him to fall back, that he was too gravely wounded to continue. He told them he was dying, that he could do no more, and he died where he stood. His death effectively ended any coordinated resistance in the main city. What followed was a massacre. Those who could reach the harbor fought for space on the ships that offered the only escape. Wealthy refugees paid fortunes for a place aboard. There were nowhere near enough ships for everyone, and the captains of several vessels reportedly sold berths at whatever the market would bear in those terrible minutes. Those who could not escape were killed or enslaved. The Mamluk soldiers moved through the city systematically, and contemporary accounts describe scenes of extraordinary violence. In the southwestern quarter of Acre, in the great Templar fortress overlooking the harbor, a different story was playing out. The surviving Templars, the knights and sergeants who had retreated to their own compound when the main city fell, barricaded themselves inside. For the Templars, surrender was not an option in any meaningful sense. They had learned from generations of experience that captured Templars were not ransomed. They were executed. There was no negotiation possible, no arrangement that would preserve their lives. So they sealed the gates of their fortress and prepared to sell their deaths as dearly as they could. The Sultan eventually sent envoys to negotiate a surrender, promising the surviving defenders safe passage in exchange for laying down their arms and opening the gates. The Templars agreed. They opened the gates. The Mamluk soldiers who entered immediately attacked the women and children who had taken refuge inside the fortress. The surviving Templars killed the envoys and sealed the gates again. There would be no second negotiation. The siege resumed with the understanding on both sides that this would end only when the fortress fell. When it fell, the fall was catastrophic for everyone inside it. According to the sources, Mamluk engineers had been undermining the foundations of the fortress walls and towers during the final stages of the siege, and when the supports were removed, a substantial section of the structure collapsed. The accounts say that the collapse killed everyone inside, Templars and Mamluk soldiers alike, in a thunderous pile of masonry and human bodies. Whether this is precisely accurate or is the kind of heroic simplification that chronicles tend toward in describing last stands, the military record is clear. No Templar who remained in Acre in May 1291 survived. The remaining Templars in the Holy Land evacuated their last coastal positions over the weeks that followed. Castle Pilgrim, the great fortress on the sea that had never been captured, was abandoned without a fight, its garrison sailing away to Cyprus. The castle at Tortosa was similarly evacuated. By August 1291, the 200-year project of maintaining a Christian military presence in the Holy Land was over. The Crusader states that had been established at such enormous cost in blood and money in 1099 were gone, and the Knights Templar, whose entire purpose, whose entire identity, whose entire claim to their extraordinary privileges, exemptions and powers, had rested on the defense of the Holy Land and the protection of pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, were left without a mission. The order relocated to Cyprus, the large Mediterranean island that was the nearest piece of Christian-controlled territory. The Grand Master, Theobald Gaudin, who had succeeded the dead William of Beaujeu, sent urgent appeals to European monarchs for a new crusade to reverse the catastrophe. The appeals were received. They were sympathized with, they were discussed at length, and they were not acted upon. The crusading spirit, which had animated European politics and religion for 200 years, had run out of fuel somewhere in the grinding decades of failed campaigns and strategic retreats. The kings of Europe had other wars, other debts, other priorities. The great project was done, and the institution that had been created specifically to serve it was left to figure out what it was for now. This was the existential crisis that shaped everything that would follow. The Templars kept their commanderies across Europe. They kept their financial networks. They kept their properties and their rents and their banking activities. They kept their legal privileges and their exemption from secular authority. What they had lost was the thing that justified all of those privileges in the minds of the rulers they operated among. Their military purpose was in indefinite suspension. Their role as protectors of pilgrims was moot in a world where no Christian pilgrimage to Jerusalem was possible. They remained wealthy, powerful, and independent, but they were no longer obviously useful in the way that had made that wealth and power and independence acceptable in the political conversations of the early 14th century. Serious proposals were being circulated for the reform of the military orders in the new post-Crusade reality. Should the Templars and the Hospitallers, who had long been rivals as much as partners, be merged into a single unified order? Should the surviving military orders reorient themselves toward new theaters? The Christian reconquest of Spain, perhaps, or crusading campaigns in the Baltic? Should the enormous financial resources of the Templars be redirected toward a new crusade under a new organizational structure? These were genuine policy questions, debated by popes and kings and scholars, and they created an opening for a certain kind of interested party who saw in the Templars not a glorious institution in need of reform, but an obstacle in need of removal. In France, that interested party had a name, a face, and a very specific set of grievances. His name was Philip, called the Fair, the fourth of that name to be King of France, a man of striking physical appearance and considerable political cunning, who had been on the throne since 1285 and who was, by the early 14th century, in serious financial difficulty. He had been fighting an expensive war with England over territory in Gascony. He had been fighting an equally expensive war with the county of Flanders, which had gone badly. He had expelled the Jews from France in 1336, confiscating their property in a brutal revenue measure that generated short-term cash and long-term damage to French commerce and intellectual life. He had tried to tax the French clergy, which had brought him into direct and explosive conflict with Pope Boniface VIII, a conflict so severe that Philip had actually had Boniface physically seized by royal agents and subjected to tray, atment so rough that the elderly pope died of shock within weeks of his release. This last episode tells you almost everything you need to know about Philip IV's approach to institutions that stood in the way of his ambitions. He was not a man who accepted constraints gracefully. He was not a man who felt that the rules that applied to other rulers necessarily applied to him. And he was not a man who forgot a debt or who felt that owing money to an institution gave that institution any particular protection from his intentions. He owed the Templars a great deal of money. The exact figures are disputed by historians working from incomplete records, but the debt was substantial, accumulated over years of borrowing to fund his expensive military campaigns. And alongside the financial debt was something that may have been even more galling to a man of Philip's temperament: dependence. The Templars had done him favors. They had lent him money when his treasury was empty. He had once, during a popular uprising in Paris, fled for personal safety to the great Templar fortress, the Temple, that dominated the northeastern quarter of his own capital city. Sheltered there by monks, he simultaneously resented and nay, aided, for a king who believed that he ruled by divine right and answered to no earthly authority. The experience of taking shelter in someone else's stronghold must have been humiliating in a way that lingered. The post-Acre reform debate gave Philip his opening. He put forward a proposal to Clement V, the new pope who was also a Frenchman and who owed his position significantly to Philip's influence, that the Templars and Hospitallers should be merged under a single military order, and that this new order should be placed under the command of a secular monarch who would lead it on crusade. The commander Philip had in mind was, naturally, Philip. The Grand Master of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, rejected this proposal clearly and firmly. He had been Grand Master since 1292. He was a man of the old order, a soldier and a knight, deeply attached to the Templars' independence, and deeply skeptical of any arrangement that would subordinate them to secular authority. His rejection was not impulsive, it was principled. And it may have been the decision that condemned him to die. Jacques de Molay's fatal miscalculation, if it was a miscalculation, was to underestimate Philip's determination and to overestimate Clement's independence. He believed that an official papal investigation would clear the Templars of the accusations that were beginning to circulate, whispered charges about irregular initiation practices, about idol worship, about financial corruption. He went to Clement and asked him to investigate, to get the matter cleared up, to defend the order's honor. He believed that investigation would produce exoneration. He was wrong. What investigation produced, in the hands of a French king with the Inquisition at his disposal and a compliant French pope in Avignon rather than Rome, was not exoneration. It was a charge sheet. Philip's ministers, led by his Chancellor Guillaume de Nogaret, spent months assembling their case. Their sources included former Templars who had been expelled from the order for misconduct, men with obvious personal grievances against an institution that had cast them out. The charges they compiled were designed to be maximum impact, the kind of accusations that would generate horror and outrage across Christendom and make the arrests that were coming seem like righteous action rather than financial predation. Too great. Denial of Christ during initiation. Spitting or urinating on the cross. Obscene kisses between brothers. Idol worship of a mysterious head called Baphomet. Financial corruption and fraud. Sexual depravity. Heresy. Each charge was calculated to be impossible to cleanly refute, because the evidence for or against it lay inside the Templars' closed and secret initiation ceremonies, which no outsider had witnessed and which the Templars' own rule forbade them from describing. The genius of Philip's approach, if genius is the right word for something so cold-blooded, was that he understood the Templars' institutional secrecy better than they understood it themselves. The Templars had kept their initiation ceremonies private for perfectly understandable reasons. They were solemn, sacred, sometimes emotionally intense rituals that deserved privacy and that the order felt should be known only to those who had undergone them. But in the hands of a skilled inquisitor with a mandate to find heresy, that secrecy looked like concealment, and concealment looked like guilt. If you will not tell us what happens in your initiation ceremony, the logic went, how can we know that something sinful does not happen there? Philip had his sealed orders prepared by early October 1377. They were sent to his sheriffs and bailiffs across France with instructions not to open them until a specific date and time. The orders described what was to be done and who was to be arrested. They had been prepared with a thoroughness and a secrecy that speaks to months of careful planning. And on the morning of Friday, October 13, 137, they were opened, and France changed overnight. The dawn raids were executed with a simultaneity that is still remarkable to consider. In every town and city where there was a Templar presence, royal officers arrived at the same moment, broke down the same doors, made the same arrests. The Grand Master Jacques de Molay was taken in Paris. The Visitor of France, Hugues de Perrot, was taken. preceptors and commanders from across the country, priests, sergeants, serving brothers. The estimates of the total number arrested that morning range from several hundred to more than 600 depending on the source. Why did the Templars, who were a military organization with experience and weapons, not resist? This question has puzzled historians ever since. Some Templars did escape, almost certainly. There are stories of small groups of knights riding out before the arrests could reach them, and the discrepancy between the treasure Philip expected to find and the treasure he actually found suggests that some movable assets were spirited away in advance. Some members of the order had received warnings, but the majority were taken without resistance, without even an attempt at organized self-defense. The most likely explanations combine the element of surprise, which was genuine and complete, with the institutional culture of the Templars themselves, men trained to obedience and submission within their own hierarchy, who may have found it psychologically impossible to resist what presented itself as legitimate authority, even when that authority was being used against them for illegitimate purposes. And there is the further possibility that de Molay himself, still convinced that investigation would produce exoneration, had given no orders to prepare for resistance, because he did not believe resistance would be necessary. He was about to discover how wrong he was. The Inquisition's dungeons were waiting. The confessions that would destroy the order were about to be extracted, and in the years of trials and torment and burning that followed, the question that would never quite be resolved was the same question that hangs over the whole story from beginning to end. What did the Knights Templar actually do in those secret rooms, behind those closed doors, in those ceremonies that no outsider was permitted to witness? The answer, which may never be fully known, is the silence at the center of one of history's greatest mysteries. The arrests had been spectacular in their speed and comprehensiveness, but what followed in the dungeons of the French Inquisition was quieter and in many ways more horrifying, precisely because of that quiet. Violence conducted in public, in daylight, with witnesses and chroniclers, generates a different kind of historical record than violence conducted in stone rooms underground, in the middle of the night, with only the torturer and the victim, and perhaps a scribe to note down what was said. The confessions that emerged from those rooms, dozens and then hundreds of them, were the product of processes that most of the men conducting them knew perfectly well would produce the results required regardless of the underlying truth. The Inquisition had centuries of experience with this mechanism. It knew how it worked. Guillaume de Paris, the Dominican friar, who served simultaneously as Philip IV's personal confessor and as the head of the French Inquisition, understood the system with the clarity of someone who had dedicated his professional life to it. The Inquisition's procedures were not arbitrary. They had been refined over generations of use against Cathar heretics in southern France, against Jews accused of various offenses, against the countless individuals who had found themselves on the wrong side of the boundary between acceptable belief and unacceptable deviation. The procedures included formal interrogation sessions at which questions were asked, recorded, and answered. They included the application of torture when initial questioning did not produce the desired confessions. They included a system of grading confessions by their completeness and usefulness, and a mechanism for producing additional sessions when a confession was judged incomplete or internally inconsistent. The charges against the Templars that the Inquisition was tasked with investigating were drawn from a formal accusation document that listed more than 100 separate articles of alleged heresy and moral corruption. Reading through this document now, with the distance of 7 centuries, what is striking is less the sensationalism of the individual charges than the systematic way in which they had been constructed to be nearly impossible to refute. They were framed as descriptions of institutional practices, not individual acts. An individual accused of a crime can produce witnesses, alibi, character references, An institution accused of systematic secret practices cannot defend itself in the same way, because the alleged practices are by definition hidden from the outside world, and the only people who could testify about them are members of the institution itself. The accusations against the Templars were cleverly designed to create a situation in which the only way to refute them was for Templars to testify about their own internal practices, which the Templars' rule of secrecy forbade them to do. This created a trap that had no good exit. If Templars refused to discuss their initiation ceremonies, they appeared to be hiding something. If they discussed them under torture, the descriptions they produced, shaped by the leading questions of their interrogators and the desperate need to say something that would make the pain stop, inevitably began to resemble the charges why were being asked to confirm. The human mind under extreme physical duress does not produce reliable information. It produces what the interrogator wants to hear, because the interrogator controls when the pain stops, and the only way to stop it is to say the thing that satisfies him. The confessions were self-generating. They did not reflect Templar reality. They reflected Templar suffering. The interrogations took place in a variety of locations across France, because the arrested Templars had been distributed to prisons throughout the kingdom, rather than concentrated in any single facility. This distribution was itself deliberate. Concentrating the prisoners would have risked collective organization, comparison of stories, resistance, scattered across dozens of different prisons in dozens of different jurisdictions. Each Templar faced his interrogators alone, without access to the accounts others had given, without the support of his brothers, without any information about what was happening beyond his own cell and his own sessions. The isolation was psychologically calculated as well as physically convenient. The sessions themselves were formally structured in ways that the Inquisition had established through long practice. An interrogator opened each session with a statement of the charges and a request for the prisoner to confess voluntarily before any measures were taken. This voluntary confession opportunity was recorded regardless of whether anything was actually confessed voluntarily, because the canonical procedure required it. Then, if voluntary confession was not forthcoming, the interrogator described what would happen next. Then torture was applied. Then the session was paused and the prisoner was asked again to confirm or elaborate on what the torture had caused him to say. Then the confirmation was written up as a formal deposition, witnessed and sealed. Then the prisoner was asked to confirm the deposition in a subsequent session held a day or several days later, when the immediate effects of the torture had had time to recede and the prisoner was no longer in the acute stage of physical agony. This confirmation step is the detail that the defenders of the process most frequently pointed to as proof of its reliability. If the confessions were simply screamed out under torture and then repudiated the moment the pain stopped, they would indeed be worthless. But if the prisoner confirmed them days later, when no current torture was being applied, did that not suggest they might reflect something genuine? The answer is that it suggested nothing of the kind, for the very good reason that the prisoner who had already confessed under torture knew perfectly well that repudiation meant a return to the same conditions, and that the cost of repudiation, as the 54 burnings of May 1310 would eventually make brutally clear, was death. The Baphomet confessions deserve particular attention because they have had the most enduring life in the subsequent Templar mythology. The name appears in the trial records in a variety of spellings: Baphomets, Baphomet, Baphomet, Mahomeri. The descriptions of what it was are, as noted, wildly inconsistent. In the Paris confessions of October and November 1307, the first wave of interrogations conducted immediately after the arrests, many Templars described a head of some kind, though the specifics varied dramatically. Some said it was a carved wooden figure. Some said it was a painting on a wooden beam. Some said it was a real human skull. Some said it had one face, some three. Some said it had two faces, one on each side, like the god Janus. Some said it was made of silver. Some said it was made of gold. Some said they had seen it in a specific location in a specific commandery. Some said they had only heard it described by others and had never actually seen it themselves. The inconsistency is diagnostic. If a real idol had been systematically worshipped in Templar commanderies across France, the descriptions of it would have been consistent, because the object would have been the same object in each location, or a series of standardized reductions of a single form. Instead, each account differs from the others in ways that track precisely with what you would expect if each prisoner was constructing his description from scratch based on the questions being asked, with no reliable source of information beyond his own imagination and the leading cues of his interrogator. No two descriptions are identical. No physical object matching any description was found in any Templar property. The most historically interesting attempt to explain Baphomet as something real rather than something confected is the theory, advanced by various scholars over the years, that the Templars had developed some form of veneration for the head of John the Baptist, a relic that had great significance in medieval Christianity, and that the Templars, given their presence in the Holy Land, might plausibly have encountered. There is a separate tradition, entirely independent of the trial charges, that associates the Sindon of Besancon and later what may be the Shroud of Turin with the Templars on the grounds that a face-bearing cloth might have been venerated in a way that, described imprecisely and interpreted through the lens of inquisitorial leading questions, could produce descriptions of a mysterious face idol called Baphomet. These are speculative but not irrational connections. They do not require the invention of a completely imaginary ritual. They require only that something real, some object or practice with genuine religious meaning within the order, was misidentified and magnified through the torture process into something it was not. The confessions regarding the denial of Christ are similarly ambiguous but slightly more substantiated. Multiple independent sources, including Templars who were not under French jurisdiction and who were therefore not subject to the same pressure, mention some element of the initiation ceremony that involved a crucifix and some kind of wired act in relation to it. The Templar priest who testified before the Papal Commission in Cyprus, for instance, described a ritual in which the initiate was ordered to spit on or near the cross as a test of obedience. He was explicit that the act was a test, that the initiate was being asked to do something that violated his instincts, and that this violation of instinct in obedience to the order's command was precisely the point. Other testimony from outside France follows a similar pattern, something involving the cross, described as a test or a discipline, not as an act of genuine desecration. If this is what the ceremony actually involved, then the Inquisition's framing of it as denial of Christ was not merely a distortion, but a deliberate inversion of its meaning. An act designed to test the depth of monastic obedience was repackaged as an act of heresy. The same external behavior, the same physical action, was given the worst possible theological interpretation, rather than the most plausible one, and that repackaging multiplied across hundreds of confessions produced by hundreds of tortured men became the official record of what the Templars had done and what they were. The obscene kiss charges, the allegations that Templar initiation involved inappropriate physical contact between brothers, are the hardest to assess because they appear in fewer confessions and in less consistent forms, and because they act less well with any plausible institutional practice that might have been misrepresented than the cross and the idol charges. They may reflect the same dynamic, leading questions producing answers that described whatever the interrogator seemed to want to hear. They may reflect genuine but minor physical elements of a ceremony that were exaggerated into something they were not. They may be entirely fabricated. The historical record does not give us enough information to be confident, and the Chinon Parchment, which addressed the cross ceremony and the idol charges, does not specifically address the kiss allegations. What the total picture of the confessions shows, when examined carefully rather than accepted at face value, is an institution whose actual initiation practices included some elements that were unusual for a religious order in the medieval Catholic Church, specifically some ceremony involving a cross and some required act in relation to it that the Templars themselves understood as a test of obedience and that their accusers chose to understand as heresy. Everything beyond that core element, the idol, the obscene kisses, the financial corruption, the systematic moral depravity, seems to have been generated by the torture process itself rather than drawn from any genuine institutional practice. The men who died under torture, or in prison, or at the stake in the years between 1007 and 1314, died for confessions that were not true in any meaningful sense. They died because a king owed their institution money and did not want to pay it back. Because a pope was too weak to protect the people it was his duty to protect. And because the mechanisms of medieval judicial power, the Inquisition, the rack, the fire, could be turned against the innocent just as effectively as against the guilty. This is the heart of the Templar story, and it is the detail that makes the story more than just a medieval curiosity. It is the detail that makes it, still, after 7 centuries, feel urgent and relevant and disturbing in ways that simple tales of treasure and curses do not. The treasure and the curses are what make the story romantic. The torture and the institutional cowardice are what make it true. The reactions of rulers across Europe to Philip's demands were not uniform. And that variation is itself historically significant, because it shows how the accusations against the Templars were perceived when stripped of the coercive pressure, that Philip could apply in France, but that he could not so easily project across borders. In England, as noted, Edward II initially refused to believe the charges and wrote indignant letters on the Templars' behalf. But the pressure from Clement, operating through the mechanisms of papal authority, even while personally under Philip's thumb, eventually produced English compliance. The English Templars were arrested, interrogated, and in some cases transported to the continent, where the more vigorous French methods of interrogation could be applied. A few English Templars confessed to lesser charges when torture was eventually permitted on English soil, but the English proceedings never produced anything approaching the wholesale condemnation that France generated. In the Iberian kingdoms, the situation was even more complex. The Templars of Aragon, Castile, and Portugal were arrested following the papal bull. But the local investigations found the charges largely unconvincing. The Aragonese Templars were allowed to defend themselves before an ecclesiastical court and were in substantial part acquitted. The Portuguese king, Denis I, was so impressed by the Templars' defense and so convinced of their military usefulness that rather than dissolving the Portuguese branch of the order, he negotiated with the Pope to have the Portuguese Templars reconstituted under a new name, the Order of Christ. This new order received the Portuguese Templar properties and continued the military and religious mission of its predecessor, eventually funding the great Portuguese voyages of exploration that would reach India and Brazil in the following century. Vasco da Gama sailed under the cross of the Order of Christ. Christopher Columbus's wife was the daughter of a Grand Master of the Order of Christ, and his ships may have carried the order's distinctive cross on their sails. The Portuguese Templars, in other words, never really disappeared. They simply changed their name and eventually helped discover the New World, a historical irony that is rarely fully appreciated. In Germany, the Teutonic Order absorbed some former Templars, and local courts found the charges against them insufficient to justify condemnation. In Cyprus, where the Templars had their eastern headquarters after the loss of Acre, the proceedings were conducted with relative restraint, and most members of the order were eventually released after minor penances. The contrast between the French outcome and the outcomes everywhere else in Europe is, on its own, a powerful argument against the idea that the charges reflected genuine institutional practice. If the Templars had really been systematically denying Christ and worshipping idols in their commanderies, those practices would have been consistent across all their houses in all their jurisdictions, not only discoverable through torture in France. The Council of Vienne, that met in 1311 to adjudicate the matter, was supposed to be the final independent arbitration of the whole question. It was not independent. Clement had convened it. Philip had arrived in person with his retinue, and the physical proximity of the French king and whatever force he had brought with him was a constant reminder to the delegates of what the practical consequences of an inconvenient verdict might be. A significant minority of the council's members were not persuaded by the case against the Templars and argued that the order deserved the right to present a formal defense, when a small group of Templars actually appeared at the council, apparently believing this was a genuine opportunity to contest the charges. They were promptly imprisoned by order of Clement, who could not afford to have a real defense conducted before an international audience. Their appearance was suppressed and their imprisonment ordered before they could say anything that might complicate the predetermined outcome. The council's eventual decision was to suppress the order without formally condemning it, a distinction that Clement apparently felt was morally significant and that historians have regarded as a face-saving formula that changed nothing. Critical. The transfer of Templar properties to the Hospitallers, which the suppression bull mandated, was carried out with varying degrees of compliance in different countries. In England and the Iberian kingdoms, the Hospitallers eventually received most of the properties they were entitled to. Though the process took years of legal argument and negotiation, in France, the king simply kept the majority of the French Templar assets, arguing, with the kind of creative legal reasoning that medieval French kings were quite good at, that the costs of the entire investigation and trial process, which he himself had instigated, entitled him to reimbursement from the assets his own actions had made available. Philip did not get rich from the Templars' destruction, at least not in the way he had intended. The portable wealth was gone. The properties came with obligations and disputes, and the process of seizing and managing former Templar holdings was itself expensive and time-consuming. He died in debt, as he had lived in debt, and the collapse of his dynasty within a generation of his death completed the irony of a plan that had promised so much and delivered so little. What the suppression of the Templars did accomplish, permanently and completely, was the destruction of an institution that had been a genuine force for something in the medieval world. Whatever its later failures, and whatever its internal contradictions, the roads to Jerusalem were a little worse after 1314. The banking services were a little less reliable. The professional military capacity available to anyone who needed it was reduced. None of these losses were irreplaceable, because the Hospitallers absorbed some of the military role and other banking institutions eventually filled the financial gaps. But the specific character of the Templars, the strange synthesis of monk and soldier and banker that Bernard of Clairvaux had articulated and that Hugh de Payens had somehow made real, was gone. It had lasted almost exactly 200 years, and it had ended in fire. The question of what the Templars believed, as distinct from what they were accused of believing, is in the end unanswerable in the way that most questions about the interior lives of medieval men are unanswerable. We cannot know what Jacques de Molay thought about as he rode through the streets of Paris in the years before his arrest, or what he prayed for in the quiet hours of the canonical night office, or what he made of the gap between the ideal, the order represented, and the reality he administered from year to year. We know that he served the order faithfully for decades, that he had fought in the Holy Land, that he had watched the fall of Acre with the eyes of someone who understood what it meant beyond the immediate military catastrophe. We know that he rejected Philip's merger proposal with a firmness that suggests genuine conviction rather than mere institutional conservatism. And we know that at the end, After 7 years of imprisonment and torture and the dissolution of everything he had given his life to, he chose to die with the truth in his mouth rather than live with a lie. That is something. In a story full of men who made the other choice, men who confessed to things they had not done because the alternative was unendurable, men who capitulated to pressure because they could not bear the cost of resistance, the Molay's final act of defiance stands out with a peculiar clarity. He knew what it would cost him. He had watched 54 of his brothers burn for less, and he said it anyway, whatever the Knights Templar actually were, whatever the truth of their ceremonies and their practices and their beliefs. The man who led them at the end of their existence met that end with the kind of courage that the Order's founding viz. Ion had always demanded, and that the historical record, despite everything, cannot take away from him. The fire on the island in the Seine went out before dawn on March 19, 1314. What remained was ash and the memory of words spoken into smoke. The memory has proved considerably more durable than the ash. 700 years later, it is still going, still generating arguments and legends and treasure hunts and novels and films and conspiracy theories and genuine historical research, still refusing to settle into the clean, simple narrative T. Hat would allow everyone to stop asking questions. The Knights Templar will not stay finished. They keep returning in new forms and new framings, because the questions at the heart of their story about power and justice and truth and the willingness of institutions to protect the innocent when protecting the innocent is inconvenient, are questions that every generation finds freshly urgent. History has a way of insisting on its own relevance, and a story of the Templars has been insisting on it for longer than most. The roads still run through the Judean hills. The pilgrims still walk them, and somewhere, if you believe some accounts, the treasure is still there, buried under a Scottish chapel, or a Canadian island, or a French valley, waiting for someone to finally find the right key to the right lock. But the more interesting treasure, the one that was never lost and never hidden, is the story itself. 9 nights and a dangerous road, and an idea that changed the world, twice, and then burned. The charges that Philip IV and his ministers had assembled against the Knights Templar were not assembled carelessly. They were assembled with the deliberate craft of men who understood both the psychology of popular outrage and the mechanics of ecclesiastical law, and who had access to a source of testimony that was simultaneously worthless as evidence of truth and invaluable as a tool of institutional destruction. The confessions of men who had been expelled from the order, disgruntled former Templars who had been cast out for disciplinary violations, men who bore personal grievances against the institution that had stripped them of their habit, were willing to describe, in vivid and damning detail, practices that may have been distorted memories of genuine ceremonies, complete fabrications, or something in between. Their accounts were inconsistent with one another in ways that a scrupulous investigator would have noted immediately. But Philip's investigators were not scrupulous. They were looking for ammunition, and they found it. The most spectacular charge, the one that would attach itself most durably to the Templar legend and echo loudest through the subsequent centuries, was the accusation of worshipping a mysterious idol called Baphomet. The name itself is strange, and its origin contested. Most modern scholars believe it is a derivation of the name Mahomet, the medieval French form of the name Muhammad, a corruption that would have made a kind of sense in an era when anything Islamic was automatically suspect in the eyes of the Christian Church, and when the Templars, who had spent generations in the Holy Land in close contact with Islamic culture and Islamic enemies, were already regarded with some suspicion as men who might have been contaminated by their proximity to the infidel. Others have proposed more elaborate etymological theories that Baphomet is a reversal of the Latin and Greek words for the father of wisdom, or that it derives from a Sufi term for initiation, or that it represents some other corruption of a word or concept absorbed from the Islamic world during the Crusades. What is clear from the confessions, and what makes them obviously unreliable as a guide to actual Templar practice, is that the descriptions of Baphomet are wildly inconsistent with one another. Some men, speaking under torture or under the threat of torture, described a bearded male head mounted on a pole. Some described a carved wooden figure of a man. Some described a cat. Some described something with 3 faces, one looking forward and one to each side. Some described something with a female body. The variation is precisely what you would expect if the interrogators were asking leading questions of men in agony, who were desperately trying to say whatever would make the pain stop, each man constructing his answer from fragments of the question itself and whatever details his imagination or his partial memory could supply to flesh it out into something that sounded plausible. No physical object matching any of these descriptions was ever found in any Templar commandery or property after the arrests, despite the fact that Philip's men searched those properties comprehensively and would certainly have displayed such discovery with maximum publicity. This absence is not definitive proof that no such object existed, but it is suggestive. If hundreds of Templar houses across France contained idols of the kind described in the confessions, it would be extraordinary if not a single one was discovered by the searchers. The charge of denying Christ during initiation is more complex because there is some evidence from multiple independent sources that the Templar initiation ceremony did include some kind of ritual involving a crucifix and some kind of ritual involving a crucifix and some kind of verbal or physical act in relation to it. The most sympathetic interpretation, and the one that the Templars who were willing to speak on the subject tended to offer, is that this was a test of obedience. A new initiate was ordered to do something apparently sacrilegious, specifically to spit near a cross, or to verbally deny Christ, as a test of his willingness to obey the order's commands, even when those commands violated his individual instincts. By obeying, he demonstrated the kind of total submission to institutional authority that the Templar rule required. The act was, on this interpretation, not heretical, but its exact opposite, an extreme form of the monastic virtue of obedience. Pope Clement V, as would be revealed by the Chinon Parchment discovered in the Vatican archives in 2001, privately accepted something very much like this interpretation. The document records that when the senior Templars, including de Molay, were interrogated by papal representatives in 1388, they admitted to certain ritual elements of their initiation that were canonically irregular, but that they explicitly and repeatedly denied were heretical in intent. The cardinals who conducted the interrogation granted them absolution for the canonical irregularities, while clearing them of the charge of heresy. Clement knew the Templars were not heretics. He granted them absolution in private, and then, because Philip's army was camped near the Council of Vienne, and because Clement's position depended on French goodwill, he allowed the public process to go forward as if the private absolution had never happened. But all of that was years in the future, when the dawn of October 13, 1377, broke over France and the arrests began. In the days immediately following, the Inquisition moved quickly. Guillaume of Paris, who served simultaneously as the royal confessor and the head of the French Inquisition, a conflict of interest so obvious that it barely needs stating, began the interrogations almost immediately. The techniques available to a medieval inquisitor intent on producing a confession were extensive and brutal. The strappado, in which the victim's hands were bound behind his back and he was suspended by his wrists with sudden drops that dislocated the shoulders. The rack, prolonged sleep deprivation, restriction of food and water, the application of fire to the soles of the feet. These were not obscure or unusual methods. They were the standard toolkit of medieval torture, well documented, widely known, and extraordinarily effective at producing whatever a determined interrogator wanted to hear. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, confessed within days. He was somewhere in his mid to late 60s by most historical estimates, born around 1240 to 1250, and therefore roughly 60 to 65 years old when the arrests came, had been a soldier his entire adult life and had presumably tinted physical hardship before. But the systematic application of torture to a man of his age and his circumstance was a different thing from the hardships of campaigning. He admitted to spitting near the cross during his initiation, though he immediately and consistently added the qualifier that he had done so with his mouth but not his heart. He denied the idol worship charges. He denied the sexual charges, but even what he did admit to was enough for Philip's purposes, because the Grand Master's confession gave the king something invaluable, a document he could send to every monarch in Europe as proof that the charges were substantiated. Within weeks, copies of de Molay's signed confession were circulating to the courts of England, the Iberian kingdoms, and the Italian states, accompanied by letters from Philip urging his fellow rulers to arrest the Templars in their own territories. The reaction across Europe was varied in ways that tell you a great deal about how the charges were actually perceived by those who had the freedom to assess them without a French army in the background. In England, Edward II initially expressed disbelief. He wrote to Philip, to Clement, and to several other rulers expressing his conviction that the Templars were good and faithful men who did not deserve to be treated in this way. He was slow to order arrests, and even slower to apply the pressure that would produce confessions. When papal authority for the use of torture was finally extended to England, the English Templars were transported to the continent where French methods could be applied, a gruesome outsourcing of the dirty work. In Germany, many Templars appeared before local courts that found the charges unconvincing and released them. In Portugal, the order was effectively reconstituted under a new name and continued operating. In Cyprus, the Templars were eventually arrested but treated with relative restraint. It was only in France, where Philip controlled the entire apparatus of investigation, that the process ran its predetermined course with full and terrible efficiency. The confessions multiplied through the autumn and winter of 1377, extracted through torture from men who had no institutional resources to protect them, no lawyers, no witnesses for the defense, no right to appeal to any authority that was not under Philip's thumb. By November, Clement had issued the papal bull Pastoralis Praeminentia, which instructed rulers across Christendom to arrest Templars in their territories, thereby endorsing after the fact what Philip had done unilaterally. The Pope, who should have been the Templars' protector, had become their captor's accomplice. The Templars who had not yet confessed under initial torture were subjected to repeat sessions. Men who had confessed and then attempted to recant their confessions when removed from the immediate context of physical pain found themselves threatened with return to those conditions. A few, with extraordinary courage or perhaps an extraordinary willingness to die, maintained their recantations. In May 1310, 54 of them were brought before the Archbishop of Sens, who happened to be a royal appointee deeply loyal to Philip, on the grounds that they were relapsed heretics. Men who had confessed received ecclesiastical absolute, and then sinned again by withdrawing their confessions. Under canon law, the penalty for relapsed heresy was not a second chance at redemption. It was death by burning. All 54 were burned at the stake in a field outside Paris on a single day. The spectacle was deliberate, and its message was unambiguous. Recantation means death, and a painful one. The effect on the remaining imprisoned Templars was immediate and largely predictable. The rate of recantation collapsed. Men who had been preparing to stand before the papal commission and withdraw their forced confessions looked at what had happened to those who had done so and concluded that survival, even at the cost of maintaining a lie about themselves and their order, was preferable to death by fire. The trials ground forward through 1311, producing the mountain of testimony. nearly all of it extracted through torture or the fear of torture that Philip needed to present to the Council of Vienne. The Council of Vienne in 1311 was supposed to be an independent ecclesiastical evaluation of the Templar question. It was not, in any meaningful sense, independent. Clement convened it. Philip attended it. Philip's army surrounded the city where it was meeting. The delegates who were inclined toward a more skeptical assessment of the charges and toward the possibility of a genuine defense for the Templars found themselves operating in an atmosphere that did not reward independence of judgment. A significant minority of the council's members resisted the suppression, arguing that the Templars had not been given a fair opportunity to defend themselves, and that the evidence against them was tainted by the methods used to obtain it. Their arguments were heard. They were not acted upon. On March 22, 1312, Pope Clement V issued the papal bull Vox in Excelso, the voice from on high, and the Knights Templar ceased to exist as a recognized institution of the Catholic Church. The bull suppressed the order, dissolved its legal identity, and transferred its properties to the Knights Hospitaller, with the practical exception that in France, Philip simply kept what he wanted, which was most of it. Individual Templars who had confessed and not recanted were assigned to do penance and then live out their lives in monastic communities. Those who had not confessed were held in continued imprisonment. Those who had confessed and then recanted were liable to be burned. A few months later, in May 1312, a second bull called Ad Providam made the property transfer to the Hospitallers official, but the Hospitallers did not receive the French Templar properties. Philip kept those. The order that the French king had accused of financial corruption had its assets seized by the man making the accusation, who then spent them on the same military campaigns the Templars' supposed wealth was supposed to have funded. The irony was probably not lost on those in the position to notice it, but those people were not in a position to say anything about it publicly, and through all of this, Jacques de Molay remained in prison. He had been Grand Master since 1292. He had been in prison since 1377. He was somewhere in his late 60s or early 70s by the time the final scene of his story arrived in the early months of 1314. An old man by any medieval standard. A man who had watched his order be tried, convicted, and dissolved hand him while he sat in a cell and waited for whatever came next. What came next was a public ceremony. On the morning of March 18, 1314, de Molay and 3 other senior Templars, including Geoffroy de Charny, preceptor of Normandy, were brought out of their imprisonment and conducted to a platform erected in front of Notre Dame Cathedral. It was a public venue, central, visible, crowded. The ceremony was intended as a final piece of theatre, the condemnation of the order's leaders, the reading of their sentences, and the formal conclusion of the entire 7-year process. The cardinals who presided expected a routine, perhaps slightly tedious formality. The condemned men would hear their sentences, which were life imprisonment, bow their heads, and be removed to whatever cell would hold them for whatever years remained to them. Jacques de Molay had other intentions. After 7 years of silence, after 7 years of confession and partial recantation and cautious maneuvering, the old Grand Master stepped forward and spoke. He declared the order innocent. He declared himself innocent. He said that the confessions that had condemned them had been extracted by torture and were worthless as evidence of truth. He said that the crimes they had been convicted of had never occurred, that the Templars had been faithful and pious servants of God and the Church, and that anyone who said otherwise was lying. Geoffroy de Charny stood with him and said the same things. The two of them, in front of the crowd gathered at Notre Dame, before the cardinals and the court officials and everyone watching, withdrew their confessions publicly and completely. The cardinals were appalled. Under canon law, the situation was now unambiguous. Men who had confessed been absolved of their heresy and then publicly and formally retracted that absolution were relapsed heretics. The penalty was mandatory and immediate: death by fire. The cardinals referred the matter to Philip, who was the secular authority responsible for carrying out the sentence. Philip did not hesitate. He ordered the burning to take place that same day. They were taken to a small island in the River Seine, a spit of land that sat downstream from the western end of the Ile de la Cité, within sight of Notre Dame itself. The island was called the Ile des Jours, or, in some sources, the Ile des Youths, an already resonant name that connected this execution to a long history of persecution. Pyres were built. The sun was still up. Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charny were tied to the stakes. What happened as the fire rose is a matter that exists at the border between history and legend. Contemporary chronicle sources, including the record of a Parisian clerk named Geoffroy de Paris, who wrote a verse chronicle of events in the city, indicate that the condemned men met their deaths with remarkable composure, that they prayed, that they showed no sign of fear, and that de Molay made some kind of declaration of the order's innocence as the fire took hold. This much seems to be historical. What the subsequent tradition added was the curse, the story that as the flames reached him, de Molay called out that both Pope Clement and King Philip IV would be summoned before God's judgment within the year, that God would avenge the innocent blood of his servants, that those who had destroyed the order would themselves be destroyed. Whether those exact words were spoken in that exact form cannot be verified. The curse, as typically repeated in later sources, has the formulaic shape of a prophecy constructed after the fact, shaped by knowledge of what actually followed rather than spoken in ignorance of it. But something was said. Multiple witnesses reported that de Molay spoke as he burned, and what followed so closely after his death that the medieval mind, which read history as a pattern of divine action, could hardly have interpreted it as coincidence. Pope Clement V died on April 20th, 1314. 33 days after de Molay's execution, he had been ill with what was likely a form of bowel cancer, a slow and painful disease that had been weakening him for some time. So his death was not entirely unexpected in the way that a sudden collapse would have been. But 33 days, the number resonated in a world saturated with symbolic numerology, and the closeness of the timing to the curse resonated even more. King Philip IV of France died on November 29, 1314. 8 months after de Molay's burning, he was 46 years old, not elderly by modern standards, though old for a medieval king who had been fighting wars since the beginning of his reign. He died of a stroke or some kind of sudden physical collapse while out hunting. He had shown no signs of serious illness beforehand, or none that the historical record preserved. His death was sudden. It was shocking to his court, and it followed the deaths of his two most important allies in the Templar affair within the same calendar year. The medieval world did not deal in coincidence. The medieval world dealt in signs, in patterns, in the working out of divine justice through the events of human history. And the pattern here was unmistakable to anyone looking at it. The man who had ordered the arrest of hundreds of faithful knights on fabricated charges, and the man who had allowed it to happen when he had the authority and arguably the obligation to stop it, were both dead within 8 months of the Grand Master's burning. The curse, or whatever de Molay had actually said at the stake, appeared to have worked. What followed made the pattern even more striking. Philip's 3 sons became kings of France in rapid succession. Louis X, who ruled from 1314 to 1316 and died at 26, likely of pleurisy, though some suspected poison. Philip V, who ruled from 1316 to 1322 and died at 28. Charles IV, who ruled from 1322 to 1328 and died at 33. None of the three left surviving male heirs. The direct Capetian line, which had ruled France continuously for more than 300 years, was extinguished within 14 years of Jacques de Molay's execution. The French throne passed to Philip of Valois, a cousin, beginning a new dynasty under circumstances that would eventually contribute to the outbreak of the 100 Years' War with England. Maurice Druon, the French novelist who wrote a celebrated series of historical novels about this period in the 20th century, titled his series The Accursed Kings, and the name has attached itself to the period in popular consciousness ever since. Whether the deaths and dynastic collapses of Philip and his sons represent the fulfillment of a dying man's curse, the working of divine providence, the ordinary brutal arbitrariness of medieval mortality, or something else entirely, is a question that admits no final answer. But the pattern is real, and the pattern was noticed at the time, and the noticing of it fed the Templar legend in ways that have not stopped feeding it 700 years later. The mystery that attracted the most immediate attention after the suppression of the order was not the curse, it was the treasure. Philip IV had expected, when he ordered the arrests in October 1307 and seized Templar properties across France, to lay his hands on a fortune that would resolve his financial difficulties and fund his military ambitions. He was the King of France, a country that contained the order's largest and most important European commanderies, including the great Templar headquarters in Paris that had served as the royal treasury. He knew, or believed he knew, that the Templars were extraordinarily wealthy, that the financial network they operated moved enormous sums, that their properties and revenues were among the greatest in the Christian world. He expected to be rich. He was disappointed. The properties were there, the land and the buildings and the infrastructure, and in time he absorbed most of those into the royal domain in France without passing them to the Hospitallers as the papal bull theoretically required. But the liquid wealth, the gold and silver and financial instruments and portable assets he had been counting on, the movable treasure that he had imagined sitting in Templar vaults waiting to be scooped up, was largely not there. It had gone. Where, nobody could definitively say. The most dramatic testimony on this subject came from a Templar sergeant named Jean de Chalon, who claimed under interrogation in June 1388 that a senior member of the order named Gérard de Villiers had received advance warning of the plan, Ned arrests, and had organized a rapid evacuation of the order's portable wealth. According to de Chalons, de Villiers had loaded the treasure onto a fleet of 18 galleys at the Atlantic port of La Rochelle and had sailed away with it to an unknown destination before the dawn of October 13th could catch them. The story is sensational, and its reliability is essentially zero. It was extracted under torture from a man who had every incentive to say something dramatic and interesting, and the detail of exactly 18 galleys has the suspicious precision of a detail invented rather than remembered. No corroborating evidence for this fleet has ever been found, and no port record, chronicle, or administrative document from La Rochelle references an unusual departure of that scale. But the story has attached itself to the Templar mystery with remarkable tenacity, partly because it is vivid, and partly because it provides a narrative explanation for the discrepancy between what Philip expected to find and what he actually found. The 18 galleys of La Rochelle have sailed through every subsequent Templar legend. They are the starting point for the theory that Templar knights fled to Scotland, carrying their treasure with them, and that they or their descendants later buried that treasure in locations that have been searched for ever since, without success. They are the premise of the Oak Island treasure story, in which theorists argue that a Templar fleet crossed the Atlantic and buried its cargo on a small island off the coast of Nova Scotia. They anchor the idea, popular in certain circles since at least the 19th century, that the Templars possessed sacred relics of enormous significance: the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, the True Cross, the head of John the Baptist. Some fragment of the sacred geography of Jerusalem that they had excavated from beneath the Temple Mount during their early decades of quartering there, and that this treasure, whatever it was, is still hidden somewhere waiting to be for. And the Scotland theory deserves particular attention because it has the most elaborate historical scaffolding of any of the post-suppression legends, even if that scaffolding turns out, under inspection, to be less solid than it appears. Scotland, in 177, was in an unusual legal position. The country was engaged in its war of independence against English domination. Robert the Bruce had been excommunicated by the Pope for the murder of a rival, and the relationship between the Scottish Church and Rome was strained to the point of non-existence. When the papal bull ordering Templar arrests was issued, it technically had no legal force in Scotland because there was no functioning mechanism for papal authority to reach there. Templars fleeing France could, in theory, have found refuge in a country where the Pope's writ did not run. The further claim that Scottish Templars or Templar refugees fought alongside Robert the Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn in June 1314, the battle at which the Scots decisively defeated an English army and secured Scottish independence, is a romantic elaboration with no contemporary documentary support. Not a single Scottish chronicle of the period mentions Templars at Bannockburn. The story appears in later sources, some of them much later, and seems to have grown in the telling as the Templar legend accumulated the kind of romantic accretions that power and mystery always attract. It is a good story. It is not a verified one. Rosslyn Chapel in Midlothian, Scotland, became the most famous location in the Templar treasure mythology after Dan Brown's novel The Da Vinci Code made it a global attraction in 2003, though the connection between Rosslyn and the Templars is considerably older than Brown's book. The chapel was built by William Sinclair, 1st Earl of Orkney, beginning in the 1440s, nearly a century and a half after the suppression of the Knights Templar. It is a remarkable piece of Gothic architecture, its interior walls carved with an extraordinary density of symbolic imagery, figures from the Bible and from classical mythology, geometric patterns, green men, angels, demons, corn cobs, and aloe vera plants that some theorists argue prove pre-Columbian contact with the Americas, Masonic symbols, and imagery that various interpreters have read as encoding everything from the location of the Holy Grail to the date of the Second Coming. The Sinclair family had a genuine historical connection to the Knights Templar. William Sinclair's ancestor, Catherine de St. Clair, had reportedly married Hugh de Payens, the Templars' founder, though the historical evidence for this is thent in. Whether this family connection had any bearing on the imagery in a chapel built 130 years after the order's suppression is a question that professional historians answer with considerable skepticism. Robert L.D. Cooper, curator of the Grand Lodge of Scotland Museum and Library, has argued that most of the supposed Masonic imagery at Rosslyn was either added or reinterpreted during a Victorian restoration of the chapel conducted by a known Freemason named David Bryce in the 1860s, and that the chapel's primary symbolic vocabulary is Orthodox Gothic Christian iconography, rather than anything more esoteric. The chapel's own administrators have been careful to present it as a remarkable work of medieval religious architecture, rather than a treasure repository, while acknowledging that the myths attract visitors in numbers that benefit the site considerably. Oak Island in Nova Scotia has been the subject of treasure hunting expeditions since 1795, when 3 young men reportedly discovered signs of deliberate excavation on the island and began digging, finding a series of apparently artificial shafts and chambers they came to call the Money Pit. The island has since attracted dozens of excavation attempts, none of which has produced any treasure, and has been featured in television programming that continues to generate substantial viewership. The Templar connection requires a chain of hypotheses, that Templars escaped France with treasure in 137, that they reached Scotland, that they sailed west across the Atlantic before Columbus, that they chose a small island in the North Atlantic to bury their cargo, and that the engineering required to create the money pit was within their capabilities. Professional archaeologists and historians generally regard this chain as unsupported at every link, but the idea that there is something buried on Oak Island has proved, commercially speaking, essentially indestructible. The connection between the Knights Templar and Freemasonry is perhaps the most interesting of the post-suppression traditions because it has had the most significant cultural influence, and because the evidence relating to it, while not supporting the dramatic claim of direct institutional descent, does suggest that the relationship between the two traditions is more complex than it first appears. Freemasonry as a public institution emerged in the early 18th century when the Grand Lodge of England was founded in 1717, and similar bodies appeared in Scotland and Ireland in the years following. From the beginning, Masonic lore included references to the medieval craft guilds of stonemasons, to the builders of Solomon's Temple, and eventually to the Knights Templar. The explicit connection between Freemasonry and the crusading orders was first articulated publicly by Andrew Michael Ramsay, a Scottish-French intellectual who gave an oration to a Parisian Masonic lodge in 1736 and 1737, in which he described the origins of the Brotherhood in terms that invoked the crusading orders and the mysteries of the Holy Land. Historians have noted that Ramsay's oration actually referenced the Knights Hospitaller rather than the Templars by name, and that it was the broader imagery of crusading knighthood, the Holy Land, and sacred brotherhood that his speech indicated. But the effect it had was to open the door to a wave of Masonic high degrees, built explicitly around Templar symbolism and mythology, as French lodges in particular seized on the romantic possibilities that Ramsay's vision had sketched out. Ramsay's oration was enormously influential in shaping the mythology of continental Freemasonry, and it launched a tradition of Masonic orders that took Templar names, ritual forms, and symbolism, the most prominent of which in the English Mortown speaking world is the Masonic Knights Templar, which forms part of the York Rite of Freemasonry and requires its members to be professing Christians. Unlike most Masonic bodies, the Masonic Knights Templar order does not itself claim direct historical descent from the medieval order. Its own documents describe its Templar elements as commemorative rather than genealogical, but the romantic tradition of a connection, the idea that somehow the knowledge and the ritual of the medieval Templars survived their suppression and found its way into the structure of 18th century Freemasonry, has been too appealing to the popular imagination to be entirely displaced by the more pedestrian truth that the Masonic Templar degrees were consciously invented in the 18th century by men who admired the Templar story and borrowed its imagery for their own purposes. There is a more interesting historical argument, advanced by scholars including the French historian Paul Nordon, that the connection between the Templars and the stonemason guilds that eventually evolved into speculative Freemasonry was real at a functional level without being a matter of secret institutional continuity. In medieval Paris, most of the working masons employed on building projects were residents of the Temple district of the city, the area around the Great Templar Fortress, and many of them worked on Templar building projects. The Templars extended their legal protection to these craftsmen, integrating them into the economic life of the commandery. This practical relationship between the military order and the craft guild could have facilitated the transmission of symbolic ideas, geometric knowledge, and ritual forms from one community to the other, without any conscious conspiracy or secret initiation chain. The Masonic fascination with Solomon's Temple, which the Templars had actually occupied, may be the most direct legacy of this practical historical connection. What the Chinon Parchment, discovered in the Vatican secret archives in September 2001 by Italian paleographer Barbara Fraile, did for the historical understanding of the Templar trials was significant in ways that go beyond the merely arcade. Mike. The document is dated August 17 to 20 all 1538, more than 9 months after the arrests, and it records a set of interrogations conducted at the Château de Chinon in the Loire Valley of France by 3 cardinals acting under direct papal commission. The cardinals were Berengar Fredo, Etienne de Suisy, and Landolfo Brancazzi, all senior figures in the College of Cardinals and men acting with the full authority of Clement V. Their mission was to interrogate the senior Templars, including Jacques de Molay himself, and to assess whether they were truly guilty of heresy. What the parchment records is that the Templar leaders admitted to certain ceremonial irregularities in their initiation practices, the ambiguous rituals involving the cross that had been at the center of the accusations, while consistently and explicitly denying that these practices were heretical in intent. They described them, using the language of obedience and discipline, as tests rather than as expressions of genuine belief, and the cardinals, having heard this explanation and assessed the men who gave it, concluded that the intent was not heretical. They granted the Templar leaders absolution. They restored them to communion with the Church. The document was sealed with the papal seal and filed in the papal archive, where it sat unread for nearly 700 years, misfiled under an incorrect reference number, overlooked by every researcher who had worked in the Vatican archive. Thus, in the intervening centuries, the significance of this discovery is multiple. First, it demonstrates that Clement V privately knew and accepted that the Templars were not heretics. He had them absolved in secret while the public trial proceeded as though that absolution had not occurred. His capitulation to Philip was not a matter of genuine conviction that the charges were true. It was a matter of political weakness, of choosing institutional survival over institutional principle. Second, the document confirms what the nature of the torture-extracted confessions already suggested, that the specific charge of heresy, the one that justified the order's suppression rather than merely its punishment for lesser offenses, was without foundation. The Templars' initiation practices were irregular. They were not heretical. The Vatican published the Chinon Parchment in 2007 as part of a facsimile edition of the complete Templar trial documents, a project called Processus contra Templarios. The edition was limited to 799 copies plus a personal copy for Pope Benedict XVI, and it was priced at an appropriate multiple of what most individuals would consider a reasonable book price. The publication was greeted by historians of the medieval church as a significant scholarly milestone, an event that clarified the historical record in an important way, even if it answered only some of the questions the Templar trial had raised. What it did not answer, and what no document discovered in any archive is likely to answer, is the question of what the Templars actually found, if anything, in the tunnels and chambers beneath the Temple Mount during the years when they re-quartered there. The tradition that they excavated beneath the mount and discovered something of enormous significance is very old, older than the suppression itself, and it is the foundation of the most elaborate versions of the Templar mystery, the Holy Grail, the cup or vessel used by Christ at the Last Supper, and associated in legend with the blood of the crucifixion, the Ark of the Covenant, the vessel in which the Israelites carried the tablets of the law through the desert, whose location had been unknown since the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. Sacred documents, secret gospels, genealogies. The proof of some theological truth so dangerous to established religion that it had to be concealed for centuries. These are the theories. None of them can be verified. None of them can be definitively disproved. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the Templars were quartered on the Temple Mount for approximately a decade, from 1119 to the late Elate and 120s, in the complex of buildings that occupied the site. Archaeological work on the Temple Mount is extraordinarily politically sensitive and has been very limited, but investigators in the 19th century documented tunnel systems beneath the mount that appear to have been expanded in the 12th century, consistent with Templar occupation of the site. Whether those tunnels represent routine engineering works for drainage and storage, or whether they were the location of more significant discoveries, is not known and may not be knowable with the access that the political situation currently permits. The gap between what we know and what we want to know is, as it has always been, the space where legend lives, and the Knights Templar have filled that space more completely than almost any other organization in history, because the ingredients of a perfect mystery are all present: genuine historical power and genuine historical destruction, a drama, and emotionally resonant ending, unresolved questions about financial assets that disappeared, a leader who died cursing his destroyers, and a subsequent tradition of secret societies that claim connection to the Order's legacy. The Templars have become, over 7 centuries of embellishment and elaboration, a vessel into which every generation pours its own version of the idea of hidden truth. The belief that if you could just pull back the right curtain, you will find the real story of the world, different from and more profound than the version everyone else has accepted. The historical Templars were, in the end, both more and less than the legend. More, because the actual story of what they achieved, the 2 centuries of military service in the most dangerous theater available, the revolutionary financial innovation that changed the structure of European economic life, the organizational sophistication that allowed a small group of French knights to build an institution operating on 4 continents within their first century of existence. That actual story is more impressive than most of the legends about hidden triosu, res and secret knowledge, less because they were human with human failings, institutional arrogance, the corruption that comes with unchecked power, the moral compromises that centuries of living between the violent world of crusading and the demanding world of monasticism inevitably produced. They were not saints. Bernard of Clairvaux tried to make them saints, or at least the institutional equivalent of saints. And for a while the logic of his theology held and the reputation sustained itself. But 2 centuries is a long time to maintain any institution at the level of idealized perfection that Bernard's vision required, and the Templars who existed in 1377 were not the same men who had patrolled the roads to Jerusalem in 1119. They were wealthier, more powerful, more deeply embedded in the political and financial structures of European life, more used to being treated with deference and more resentful of any challenge to their independence. Whether any of this made them guilty of the specific charges Philip leveled against them is another question, and the answer from the best available historical evidence is no. They were not guilty of those things, or at least not guilty in any systematic or institutional way. The real crime was Philip's, and the real failure was Clement's. A king used the institutional tools of medieval Europe, the Inquisition, the torture chamber, the controlled legal process, to destroy an organization he feared and envied and was indebted to, and the Pope lacked the courage to use the authority he had been given to stop it. That is the core of what happened in France between 1307 and 1314. Everything else, the confessions, the burnings, the dissolution, the curse, the missing treasure, all of it flows from that center. Jacques de Molay burned on March 18, 1314. He was somewhere between 60 and 70 years old. He had given his life to an institution he believed in with complete sincerity, had led that institution through the worst catastrophe it ever faced, had tried to save it by cooperation, and then by recantation, had watched it dissolved by Each church, it had served faithfully for 2 centuries and had died declaring its innocence to a crowd gathered outside the greatest cathedral in France. Whatever he said as the fire took him, whether it was a curse or a prayer, or simply the psalms he had been reciting his entire adult life, the words went up with the smoke into the March sky over Paris, and the world that heard them remember. Read. Both men he named were dead before the year ended. His order was dissolved. His treasure was never found. His name was given to a youth organization in America in the 20th century that has since initiated millions of young men who may or may not know the story behind the name they bear. His story has been told in dozens of languages, interpreted from dozens of angles, used as an argument for everything from the justice of royal power to the corruption of the church, to the necessity of secret societies, to the danger of debt, to D. He has been a villain in some tellings and a martyr in others, and probably the truth is that he was neither, only a man who did his best in circumstances, that his best was not enough to overcome. The roads to Jerusalem are still there. They are different roads now, paved and signposted, crossed by borders and checkpoints, and the complications of a geopolitical situation that the medieval crusaders would have found incomprehensible, but the essential facts of them are the same. They are roads to one of the most contested pieces of geography on Earth. Roads that people walk for reasons of faith and history and personal meaning that are not so different from the reasons that pilgrims walked them in 1119. Roads that are still not entirely safe and that still require, as they always have, the willingness to set out into uncertainty in the direction of something you believe is worth the risk. The Temple Mount is still there, at the center of everything. It carries the Dome of the Rock now, one of the oldest and most beautiful buildings in the world, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Western Wall, and the weight of 3 religions worth of history and claim and longing. The great questions it has always provoked have not been answered. The space beneath it has not been fully investigated. Whatever the Templars found there, or didn't find, or thought they found and were wrong about, remains unknown. The commanderies are mostly ruins or converted into other things. A Templar chapel that became a parish church. A Templar barn that became a farmhouse. A Templar fortress whose stones were used to build something else in the centuries after. The order's dissolution. The white mantles and the red crosses are gone. Except in museums and in the ceremonial costumes of Masonic orders that borrowed the imagery without inheriting the institution. The financial innovations the Templars created are so thoroughly embedded in the structure of modern banking that we no longer need to mention them specifically. They are the water we swim in, the invisible infrastructure of every transactee, conducted electronically, every letter of credit, every international wire transfer, every time a depositor in one city receives credit for funds lodged in another. What remains, beyond the physical traces and the institutional legacies, is the story itself. And the story remains because it contains, in concentrated form, something that human beings have always found both frightening and fascinating. The demonstration that power, however apparently secure, however apparently righteous, however apparently protected by law and custom and religious authority, is ultimately fragile. The Knights Templar were one of the most powerful and most protected organizations in medieval Europe. They answered to no king. They paid no taxes. They were exempt from excommunication. They had the blessing of the Pope and the gratitude of a continent's worth of rulers who had borrowed their money and relied on their military muscle. And it took one determined king and one weak pope 7 years to destroy them completely. And the tools used were lies and torture and the political manipulation of legal processes that were supposed to protect the innocent. The lesson is not comfortable. It is not the lesson that institutions like to teach about themselves. It is the lesson that history, when you look at it clearly, keeps insisting on. That the powerful are never as safe as they appear. that the innocent are not protected by their innocence, and that the machinery of legitimate authority, the court, the Inquisition, the legal process, the church itself, can be turned against anyone if the person with the power to turn it is determined enough and the person responsible for stopping the turning is weak enough. Jacques de Molay knew this at the end. He had learned it the hard way over 7 years of prison and torture and watching his order destroyed around him. And he said something, there on the island in the Seine with the fire at his feet, that was true enough and strange enough and resonant enough that 7 centuries of historians and novelists and conspiracy theorists and treasure hunters were still not quite finished with it. We probably never will be. If this story has kept you company tonight, if the history of these warrior monks and their strange, improbable, magnificent, ultimately doomed institution has stirred something in you, the way that the best history always does, please consider pressing the like button and subscribing to the channel. It takes a moment, and it truly helps us keep making these journeys into the past together. We put out new episodes regularly, each one researched and written with the same care you've heard tonight. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from, and tell us what part of the Templar story stayed with you as the night goes on. We'll see you next time. Good night.